So this webinar really is brought to you by Group BC in conjunction with Operam, and it came about by chance really. I was attending the CETA BIM gathering, so a technology and industry process event in Ireland at Croke Park, and I saw Paul present. And in a world that's suffering and an industry that's suffering from BIM fatigue, Paul really did resonate and speak quite a lot of sense, really helping industry at a macro level right down to an organisational level understand their place in the world, and in an industry that's ripe for technological disruption, how businesses can actually plan and map out their journey. And on the basis of that, Paul and I agreed on a webinar format, and I'm delighted to say that he will be taking the lion's share of today's presentation. Just very briefly, by way of introduction, for the past 20 years, Group BC have been supporting organisations that operate in and around the built environment. So that's architects, engineers, construction consultants, project managers, tier 1 contractors down into the tier 2 trades as well. Be more joined up in the way that they manage information. I think uniquely we also work with probably 60% of our clients are major asset owning clients as well in retail, utilities, government and defence as well. And it's given us a great perspective in terms of starting with the end in mind, listening to what clients are trying to achieve, and certainly with the advent of BIM and the change that we've been going through technologically as a result of that, we've seen some of the pains and challenges that organisations are going through, and why digital transformation and a rational framework is very useful for businesses to sit back and address. So just to share with you some of the organisations that influence our direction, our roadmap. So businesses here of all shapes and sizes, predominantly UK based, but quite a number with an international reach as well, recognising that we are in a global industry, and the thirst for access to information, either in the office, on the move, in the UK or internationally, evidently is always there. And this collection of clients that you see on screen have certainly over the past 20 years helped shape the direction that we ourselves are moving in. And as I say, we sit in this place of providing a system that supports everything from early stage concept design to project delivery and handover into the asset owning client as well. And because we straddle both camps, we're able to provide, and this is quite a complex diagram, I appreciate, but we're able to provide both project information and client side management tools as well for managing that asset information. And what we're finding is that clients are becoming a little bit more articulate, often under advice at what they're trying to achieve, just for the long-term retention of knowledge for the operation of their built assets. So we sit in an industry that is a significant contributor to GDP, not only in the UK but substantially in underpinning most global economies. And I'll just highlight on this McKinsey infographic here, 1.6 trillion pound of additional value add could be created through higher productivity. And when we think about from Egan Latham through to the current BIM drive and digital built Britain, right at the core of this is our positive drivers for change, and clearly we're an industry that can do better. When we look at the top 10 contractors operating on average off a margin of around 1%, there's definite scope for improvement. And ultimately, the golden egg, and as Group BC, as a vendor selling it into an industry, we often see clients with recognisable business pain and the straw that breaks the camel's back, that breaks the status quo, that makes businesses take action, might often be something like a construction claim. Loss of information means that they're struggling to resolve certain business challenges, and then they rush for an answer. Now, I could sit here as a vendor and say I'm delighted to sell to businesses that come to us rushing for an answer, but for an exemplar project to land successfully in that business, if it doesn't come with that board level sponsorship and with a clear understanding of the business objectives and aims, we end up with a delivered piece of technology, but it doesn't necessarily land, be absorbed and be fully mobilized by the organisation in pursuit of what they're trying to achieve. So, with that in mind, we'll now hand over to Paul, who will provide us with a real clear view of digital transformation in the construction industry.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully, you can all see my my screen. Okay, as Stuart said, it is a bit of a mouthful in terms of the title, but what we're going to be talking about today is around the topic of digital transformation, particularly at an organisational level, and looking at the progressive and phased approach to developing the capability and capacity needed to achieve sustained success. And what we mean by that is the ability to learn from when things don't go so well, and to repeat when things do go so well, so that as an organisation you can continue to build upon a sustained success. So, all right, just a little bit about myself. My background's in military engineering, which is a little bit like civil engineering, except the uniform's slightly different. I think I was in the Royal Engineers for around 10 years, and it was around a time when we were moving off the drawing board onto CAD, or computer-aided design, and I guess that was my first experience of a digital transformation, moving from the pen to the mouse. And it was at a time in an organisation, shall I say, where working collaboratively and working as a team is at the forefront of what they do. And so, on reflection, that transition or that transformation seemed to be quite easy. It was only at the point when I left and discovered things like contracts and profit did all this transformation begin to become a bit more of a challenge. I'm going to pick up when I moved to London Underground back in 2007. I was brought into the organisation predominantly to improve the way in which London Underground procured and used data about their assets. London Underground are the largest asset owner in central London, and we began by looking at some of the technology that was available to London Underground, and identified a business need to be able to bring all the data about the assets into one place, which we now know and love as a common data environment. So a lot of the work started off around the technology, but having gone through that process, we still struggled really to get the adoption that we were hoping for, and therefore the business benefits of that investment. So we took the decision to move away from the technology and to set up what is essentially a business change program. And one of the best things that I did at that time was to bring in a change manager from outside industry, who understood around business change and at an individual level, people's personal change journeys. And it was only at that point that we actually start to see a bit of traction in terms of the level of understanding for the need to manage information effectively, and also to use some of the enabling technologies that we'd provided. I left London Underground in 2012 and set up initially on my own with Operam, and we've been going for 5 years, and the company's grown at a steady rate. As a hobby, I also help out with the British Standards Institution. I sit on the B555 committee who look after all the standards relating to the architectural engineering and construction industry. I was co-author of PAS 1192 Part 2, which, for those of you familiar with that, is essentially the framework document for BIM Level 2 in the UK. What you feel about that standard is may be indifferent, but what we saw, although it was written into the UK construction strategy in 2011, a lot of international clients also started to incorporate the processes within that standard within their contracts, which meant that the international community felt that was a little bit unfair, having UK standards within a contract. So there was a request to elevate a lot of the 1192 standards to international level, and I was fortunate to be invited by or asked by ISO to elevate a lot of the standards, and which we've been doing for the past 4 years. Some of you may have heard about ISO 19650, which will hopefully be published at the end of this year and will eventually supersede a lot of the 1192 standards in the UK. In terms of Operam, well, as Stuart says, basically we help organisations to develop the capability and capacity they need to achieve whatever their business goals are, whether that's as a client, as a supplier, and quite often the lines are blurred, where a lot of suppliers are also clients in their own right, either through the asset or through the operational phase. And we've been fortunate to work with a lot of really good organisations who have identified this sort of need and at different levels embarked upon a digital transformation. And that knowledge and experience is what we've combined together. There's two sides to the business. Essentially, we've got on the left advisory services, and through that experience of digital transformation, we've developed a framework essentially to support or to communicate what that transformation could look like, and to support organisations. And I'll show you briefly what that is about later on. On the right-hand side, we've got the educational resources. What we found when working with organisations, there's a real need to educate people across the organisation in terms of the drivers and the impact of introducing these types of business processes. That's led on to the learn development framework, which provides online and offline education to individuals. Both of those sides of the business ultimately is what we aim to help organisations to achieve their business goals. So that's a little bit of a background about myself and the company, which hopefully gives you an idea as to why I think I can talk to you about this subject today. So what I'd like to cover is starting looking a little bit wider in terms of the UK industry perspective. Rightly or wrongly, the UK has taken up a position as sort of leaders on digital transformation, which is being closely followed by a lot of other countries around the world. But then really to start digging down into what that looks like from an organisational perspective, sharing some lessons learned in terms of our experience and what we feel goes wrong for a lot of these projects, and then to take you through the progressive approach in terms of some key points and recommendations for organisations either already on a digital transformation or considering moving forward. So to begin with, I just want to look at these two words in terms of digital transformation and what it is. I think over the last couple of years, these two words have been put together and are becoming more increasingly commonplace, particularly in the press and at conferences. But if we just look at the word transformation from an organisational point of view, a transformation is a whole scale change to an organisation, from its operating model to its infrastructure, what it sells, who it sells to, and how it goes to market. Essentially, how it does its business. And a transformation program, without a shadow of a doubt, will typically touch every function within a business. Okay, not from purchase and finance, human resources, right the way through to operations, sales, and marketing. And that's regardless of what kind of transformation, typically that is what we mean by the word transformation. In terms of digital, obviously this is a word which is, I suspect, is going to suffer the same fate as the term BIM, where you're going to end up with so many different definitions that it's very difficult to pin down. But for my perspective, digital is something that we've experienced at an individual level, ranging from our mobile devices, Google Maps, and Apple. The opportunities really for digital technologies to support the way in which we live, work, and socialize. So really, for us, digital transformation is looking at that whole scale change, the fundamental change at an organizational level, really to exploit the opportunities that a digital world can present to us. From a UK industry perspective, Stuart picked up on a couple of the main reports around Egan and Latham, so I'm not going to go into too much detail around the problems within the industry. It's probably fair to say that we lack productivity compared to a lot of other industries, and we also work upon quite a tight profit margin. So in terms of real tangible metrics, for me, one of the best things is one of the recommendations from those reports was to set up an organisation known as Construction Excellence, who have been taking key performance indicators of the UK construction industry over the past 10 years. And there's two of them which stand out for me particularly, that I feel better management of information could improve upon. So we've got the two KPIs. We've got cost predictability and time predictability. And you can see from a cost predictability point of view, over the last 10 years, we've started off at 46%, and we've made a reasonable improvement on that, and we're in 2016. So all projects that were completed in 2016 were delivered on budget or better. When we look at the time predictability, you can see again a similar starting point, but over the last 10 years, for all the sort of initiatives and all the technology that's now available to us, we've actually we've gotten worse really in terms of our ability to predict the time at which it takes to deliver a project. So what this means is essentially, as an asset owner or as a construction client, roughly you have a 50-50 chance of getting your asset delivered on time and on budget. Now, as a consumer, I can't imagine a world where you would accept that level of service from any industry. And I think as the projects get bigger and more complex, those odds are actually getting tighter. So you can see why both industry and clients are starting to look at ways to improve that. Now, there may be a few of you out there saying, okay, so what? These problems have been known for a long time. There's still plenty of work. Things still need to be built, and there's still plenty of opportunities for people to win work and to deliver assets. So, but from an industry perspective, if we just look at experiences from other industries, one that is quite close to myself is the automotive industry. My dad worked for Ford's up in Halewood in the northwest, and so I, at a young age, witnessed this a similar drivers for change within the automotive industry, and I remember a lot of the strikes that were going on across the UK, and resistance really to change within the automotive industry, and that really was compounded by external international pressures, where other nations, mainly in Japan and others, were able to produce and manufacture exactly the exact same car for a lot less money and a lot quicker. And it was only at that point, it was only at the point when people within the UK automotive industry realised that there wouldn't be a UK automotive industry unless they did change, did things start to happen. Now, in the change world, we would call that a burning platform. And you could argue, have we reached that point in the UK construction industry? I think with the globalization and other influences, mainly from Asia, in terms of the ability to deliver large, complex projects with increased cost and time predictability, is putting real pressure on our position at a global level. So, in terms of trying to transform an industry, obviously it's not that simple. A few of you may be familiar with this diagram, which is affectionately known as the bin wedge, which was produced by Mark Bew and Mervyn Richards. Essentially, it's a very quick napkin sketch, which has been used to sort of support the UK's initiative. And if you've seen it presented before, you've probably seen it presented in a number of different ways. But for myself, from a transformation point of view, it is actually it outlines the journey to or the UK industry's digital transformation journey, and it's got all the right ingredients. On the left, we've got our current state. On the right, and we've got our future state, where the industry needs to get to. And in the centre, we have our transition states, so our progressive steps from the current state towards that future state. And we can start to map out some timelines on this as well. I've identified 2007, which is the publication of BS 1192, off the back of the Avanti research project and the work undertaken at Heathrow Terminal 5. We've got 2011, which is the publication of the UK construction strategy, which set out the journey in a bit more detail from a UK construction perspective. 2016, or April 2016, which was the date from which the objectives within the construction strategy came into effect. And then we've got 2025, which is really the next sort of horizon around for the global industry, where there's anticipated around £12 trillion worth of construction spend, and really around preparing the UK industry to tap into that. That future state in recent years has been branded as Digital Built Britain, because it starts to incorporate a number of different initiatives, not just around BIM, but also around the information economy, smart cities, Internet of Things, and so on. So collectively have been branded Digital Built Britain. As a transformational journey, there is no ending. Okay, this is not a destination; it's a direction of travel. And so, what we're looking at here in terms of the bin wedge is moving from where we are today, i.e., our current state, and setting out a direction of travel towards that Digital Built Britain. The keynote, or the key thing to take away from these, is that these indicators, or these different levels, are starting points. Okay, so you should read this as from 2011, from 2016, and from 2025. A lot of people get caught up in this by 2016, or sorry, BIM level 2 was by 2016. We'll all be doing BIM level 2. Okay, the way to think around it is that from 2016, industry will start to implement the business processes associated with BIM level 2, and ultimately we've got 9 years in order to do that before we start looking at level 3. So it's really much a case of focusing on getting good at level 2. The other thing about this wedge is it's split into two. At the top, which is where most people focus in on, is around the data and methods associated to each level. But at the bottom, which for me is probably the most important bit, is around the business processes. And these span across each of the 3 levels. So to give you an idea of how I would interpret this wedge, level 0, or the current state, is typically defined by the usual chaos which we've been experienced within the industry over the years, where teams and individuals are almost doing their own thing, working in their own way, lack of collaboration, and this adversarial approach that we tend to see on many projects. And that transition from level 0 to level 1 was really, from a process point of view, was just getting good at managing information. So building better teams, being able to work collaboratively as a team to manage and produce information. And that was using whatever the current methods were that you were using at that time, be it in 2D or 3D as a team. From a change point of view, you don't want to go run before you can walk, to use an old adage. So the main focus was around just getting good at managing information using whatever methods or tools you were using at that time. The transition from level 1 to level 2 was there a bit more focus around getting better at managing information. So we started to see a lot of the construction clients and asset owners now coming on board, understanding their need for information and setting up the right commercial and collaborative environment for suppliers to work collaboratively, not only as a team, but across teams. Based on that foundation, you're then able to then start introducing new methods. So some of the new innovative technologies that we're looking at today in terms of the a lot of the software, a lot of the hardware that is now available to the industry. A lot of that can begin to be introduced once we get better at managing information. And that's really the point at which we are at the moment. Moving forward from level 2 to level 3, although that's yet to be defined, what we do know is that essentially, from a process point of view, the effective management of information will just be business as usual. Okay, there'll be less emphasis around looking at the business processes, because it will just be how clients go out and procure and how suppliers deliver the information that's needed. But based on that foundation, what that does mean is that we're able to introduce innovative methods, ways of working and tools, things that we probably can't even imagine as we sit here today. iPhone's been around for 10 years. We're starting to see new innovative methods become business as usual. So undoubtedly there will be new methods and new ways of working to achieve the same results, but in a much more effective manner. From a data perspective, the differentiation probably lies between level 1 and level 2. We're still in this world of proprietary data formats. So what that means is, depending on your weapon of choice or the tool that you use, you will be pretty much held hostage to that particular data format, and the ability to or the interoperability between the different platforms is not impossible, but tends to mean that you would need some form of exchange format. What we know about level 3 is that one of the key elements of it is that data will be open, and that we will no longer be worrying about what the format is or what tool has been used to produce it or to analyze it or to use it, because the data will be in such an open format. So that's really my interpretation of this bin wedge, and as I say, depending on if you've seen that before, you may have seen that in a number of different ways. So the question is, how are we doing? So this is really a bit of a candid look, maybe a little bit unfair, but certainly from our experience, this is where we see the industry's at. We're still in a world where a lot of asset owners and construction clients are still unsure around what this thing actually means, what their responsibilities are, and are ultimately going out to procure with the words, "Give me BIM." Okay, we're starting to see BIM in a lot more contracts, or at best BIM level 2, but without actually understanding what their role is and what the impact is on their project. On the supply side, particularly at the business development teams and the bid teams, of course you're going to say, yes, we do BIM. We've been the best BIMers since BIM began, without understanding the risks that you're bringing into the organization or the impact that might have on the particular project. So there's clearly a gap in the knowledge between both the clients and the suppliers. And unfortunately, a lot of those gaps are being fulfilled or being filled by the technology providers, okay, who are offering their solutions and their tools in order to relate the term BIM to their particular technology. And it's at that point that the project teams come in, and they're left at this point where they really don't know where to start. They've been told that they're now working on a BIM project and they will be working with these new tools, and away you go. And that is really causing a lot of pressure on a lot of individuals and a lot of frustration. I don't want to paint too much of a bad picture. There have been a number of successes, mainly isolated successes where a particular activity has been undertaken, or a particular team or teams have worked really well. But the problem we have in the industry is our ability to repeat those successes and achieve that sustained success. Because what we find is on projects where things have gone well, on the next project, it may be with a different client, maybe with a different team, we're back to revert into type in terms of where we've always been. And so for me, that's really where we are at the moment from the industry. From an organizational perspective, really we need to start looking at why organizations are undertaking or thinking about undertaking a digital transformation. Typically, there are 3 reasons. The first is because they want to. Either as a client, they want to optimize their asset portfolio. From a supplier, they want to be more effective, maybe win more work, increase profit, reduce risk, whatever it might be. The second is because they need to. Either as a client, they are maybe looking to have their budgets cut. They may have to be doing more with the assets that they've got in terms of delivering the services. From a supply point of view, it might be increased competition. It might be through restructuring. It might be from acquisition. But they need to undertake or define that unified approach to the way in which they work. And the third one we see is because they have to. Now, this generally comes from legislation, but we've seen a lot. Obviously, if you're bidding for government work, then essentially you have to work or adopt a collaborative approach in accordance with BIM Level 2 in order to win work. And what we're seeing at the moment is really, to coin a phrase, this perfect storm. What that means is that organisations at the moment are actually all 3 are coming into play. In terms of they want to, they need to, and they have to. And this really is what I think is starting to trigger a lot of these digital transformations within the organizations. To give you an idea, this is a poll from the Institution of Civil Engineers, who asked a simple question around where are you on your digital transformation journey. And what you can see here is that there's over 35% are initiating their change management, and with the remainder either developing a strategy or starting to look at engaging with those key stakeholders. Only a small percentage are not even at that point. So essentially 95% of the respondents are embarking on or already on their digital transformation journey, which is great. However, what we also know, and this is a report from Forbes from last year, is that 84% of companies fail at digital transformation. That's a huge number, and this really is what is causing a lot of concern for organisations. Just digging a little bit deeper into that, from that report, essentially one of the things that stood out for me is this observation, is that really organisations are not prepared to change their behaviour or their culture. And they think they just need to have a strategy and invest in a bit more technology, and away they go. And this is really why we're seeing a lot of frustration, both at the leadership level, but also at the management and also at the sort of the technical level. Okay, at all levels across the organisation, there's a lot of frustration where organisations are just running headfirst into this world of digital transformation without actually having a defined strategy or a plan in order to support the individuals within that organisation on that journey. So what we find is we'll end up with this, a lot of organisations with this question, to coin a phrase again, to BIM or not to BIM. And for some reason, people within the industry have turned this thing BIM into a thing. And we've heard a lot of organisations saying, right, okay, our next project will be a BIM project, or from 2018, all of our projects will be BIM projects, and it's turning it into a thing. And from a change point of view, that's not really the, by turning it into a thing, that is what creates a lot of the fear and apprehension within individuals. So to answer this question, if your understanding of BIM is producing a 3D model, and that's what BIM means to you, then I would probably say no. If BIM means around improving the way in which you manage information, then I would say yes. Because on every project, on every piece of work that you've done, you've had to manage information, whether that's analog information or digital information. What this initiative is around is just improving the way in which that information is managed. So getting good at managing information, and we're taking a collaborative approach to both its production and its exchange. So in terms of a lot of the organizations and that have embarked upon this, there are some things that we can see typically in terms of what goes wrong. And to explain this, we're going to look around the traditional people, process and technology, the three sort of key elements around a digital transformation. But as we know, nothing happens in an organization without the leadership being involved. And because this is a collaborative approach, and then most organizations will need some partners involved, be it a customer or be it a supply chain. Okay, so from these different elements, what we tend to see is that there will be some external demands, be it from customers, from clients, from suppliers, or other external factors. And as Stuart mentioned in his introduction, there's a knee-jerk approach to that in terms of, right, let's do BIM. Okay, that's really the limit of the direction from a lot of the leadership teams. From that, the first thing is port of call is to typically to go out and procure a number of enabling technologies based around this thing BIM and what they feel is needed within that organization, without really understanding the functional or non-functional requirements for that technology. If you're lucky, they will also then look at some of the industry standards, and rather than actually understanding what standards, method and procedures are needed, we're starting to see a lot of people will be quoting BS 1192 or in accordance with PAS 1192 Part 2. They are not standards in that purest sense. I think one of the interesting things for me, HS2 did an upskilling study a number of years ago, and one of the questions was around, are you using these industry standards? And I think as around 34% responded yes to PAS 1192 Part 3, which looks at the operational phase. Yet the standard had only been published 2 weeks earlier. So you can start to see that people are just jumping onto these standards without really understanding what's within those different documentation. And if you're lucky, they will also invest in some skills. Typically, that's if you go online, look for BIM training. Each of the platform providers will offer some level of training around their particular tools. But what we find is this is pretty much like teaching someone how to use a hammer, but not actually teaching them how to use that hammer to construct an asset. What this results in is when they start working with their partners and their customers, it starts to build up on delays, additional costs, and ultimately conflict. Okay, and we're starting to see a lot of projects who are getting burned quite heavily by the introduction of what they perceive to be as BIM. What then happens is the leadership team then get a fright, and obviously their expectations are not being reached, so they then close shop and say, right, let's not do BIM, let's go back to how we've always revert to type. Yet those external demands that were there in the start place are still there, and what they've now got is a nice big white elephant of enabling technologies that they've invested in that they're not actually now utilizing. So what does a progressive approach look like? So again, going back to our main slides around people, process, technology, leadership and partners. So this is really how we would advise organizations in terms of looking at a progressive approach. The first thing is it has to come from internal business goals. Now, a lot of those business goals may be driven by external factors, okay, but ultimately an organization should have a clear set of business goals. If you haven't, then you've got bigger problems than BIM. But essentially what you're looking to do is to work out what opportunities digital information can do to support those business goals. From that, it's up to the leadership really to start looking at or agreeing the digital strategies, but also putting some plans in place to deliver those strategies and making sure that those are fully resourced and the policies are in place to support it. The next thing we're looking now really is around the people within the organisation. So these are the people who are going to make the change happen. They should have a really good understanding of their organisation, their profession, but also in order to make the transformation, they also need the knowledge around what this means, what the new business processes are, what the impact is, what the risks are going to be to their organisation. So they need educating and to acquire that knowledge. And they can use the knowledge both of the new ways of working and their organisation to define some business processes that work for their organisation. So we're not just talking around the 1192 series. These are business processes that are mapped out to suit their particular organisation. Yes, they should be aligned with the industry standards and best practice, but by using that knowledge, they're able to better define the activities really that organisation takes on. From that, from a technology point of view, looking at the activities within the processes, you can then start to look at the functional and non-functional requirements for that technology. Now, quite often what we find is that organizations will already have a number of enabling technologies within their organization, and so they can do a gap analysis, and if there are any gaps, then they may need to go out and procure additional technologies, but that's not always the case, and it's not a prerequisite for adopting BIM. From that, we've then got the tools. We need to start dig down looking at what the standards are going to be used and the methods and procedures, and these need to be based on the activities defined within the business processes, not driven by the enabling technologies that are being used. From that point, we can then start to look at the people side of things and educating them and training them on the skills that they need to actually adopt those standards and implement those standards, the methods and procedures that have been agreed. At that point, we can then start to look at some early adopter projects and capturing lessons learned in terms of what went well, what didn't go so well. And then to finish this loop, it then comes back in terms of those lessons learned, acquiring more knowledge, and then we go through the cycle yet again. So that's what we mean by a progressive approach. In terms of the people, process, and technology side of things, probably the two biggest questions we get is around how much does it cost and how long will it take? Typically, if you're an executive or a leadership team, they're really the two questions that first come. Largely, it depends on your starting point in terms of your organisation. So from a people point of view, how capable are the people you've currently got? From a process, do you already have clearly defined processes? And from a technology point of view, in terms of what enabling technologies you have. And likewise with the time, obviously it's going to depend on the size of the organisation, the complexity of the organisation. So without obviously giving you an exact number, as a rule of thumb, what we would suggest is that each of these three, that in terms of the costs and the time, are roughly the same. So the same amount of investment needs to go into the people, the processes, and the technology. And roughly they will probably take around the same amount of time. To give you an indication from I would say from a medium-sized organization, for a digital transformation to get to an integrated state, you're probably looking at around 3 to 5 years. For a particular project, just to get a repeatable approach, I would say you'd be doing well if you could get that done within 6 months, but I would tend to allow 12 months really to prepare a repeatable approach that you could then start to test on some early adopters. So just to look at around the first steps then. The first thing really for an organization thinking about a digital transformation is to know where you're starting from and importantly why you can't stay there. So that's understanding from a people, process and technology point of view, what is the current capability and capacity at each of those 3 levels. Why you can't stay there from a change point of view, this is vital, not only to identify why you can't stay there, but also to communicate that across the organization. So why the way in which you work at the moment needs to change. The next step is to look at where you're going, where you're heading, what your future state will be, and what it will look like when you get there. Obviously, there'll be some benefits and maybe some disbenefits, but ultimately, again, that needs to be clearly defined and communicated throughout the organisation. And then finally, to look at to plan the steps of your journey and how you will support individuals through that journey, because everyone learns and changes at a different pace. So it's important that those steps are identified and a plan is put in place to support individuals from your innovators to what we would refer to as laggards. So just to summarize them, so in terms of digital transformation, the UK's industry digital transformation is towards this thing known as a digitally built Britain, and everybody has a part to play in that at an individual level, at an organisational level, at an industry level, in order for us to achieve that. A digital transformation is a people project and not an IT project. If you run your digital transformations as a people-centered initiative, then you're likely to get a lot more traction and a lot more benefit from that. It will touch every function within the organization. Okay, this is not just about the technical people. This goes right across at every level of the organization. It is expensive. Okay, there's no getting away from that. It is risky, and more importantly, we're generally not very good at it. Okay, so that's not really a good starting point, but it's not impossible. And on the flip side of that, organizations are facing this perfect storm in terms they either want to, they either need to, or they have to transform. So we're starting to see that burn-in platform come into place. So it's about how you manage this transformation, not if you go on it. Before thinking about it, organizations must have a clearly defined set of business goals, rather than just being reactive to external factors. Have the leadership team looking at having that agreed digital strategy and resource plan to support the business goals. There's no point just having a strategy and putting it on the intranet and then expecting the business to transform. Key to that, from the start and right the way through the transformation, is strong leadership and clear communications. I think they're probably the two things from any change management perspective. Without those two, then your fate is pretty much sealed. And then finally, looking at that progressive approach to developing the capability and capacity needed to achieve that sustained success. And that is it from me. Stuart.
Right, thank you, Paul. I'll just put the control back to Stuart if you hold.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Just a few points I noted during that talk. Yeah, clearly as an industry, we've got to start managing information, manage it better, and manage it more effectively. And one of the big takeaways is then making that business as usual. And I think if I had my time again in this industry, I'd set up an agency for document controllers, or now rebranded as information managers, as one of the vital set of people that are really holding the industry together with rubber bands and sticky tape at the moment. I joke, of course. I also note the point that transition that you made from level 2 to level 3, and this drive toward open standards. And I think ourselves, so we sit in the UK BIM Alliance Technology Group, and there's a real consensus amongst the majority of vendors in that group to really want to work together. And there are talks now of reinstigating an initiative back from 2003, actually, to try and get many of these platform providers, design tool providers, operational system vendors providing information to and systems to industry that are conversant with one another. And certainly that's been right at the core of our strategy and how we've embraced things like open BIM standards and formats like IFC and information delivery formats like like Kobe. Dare I say, Excel actually is the intermediary that tends to hold everything together. So we'll move to a Q&A. So my colleague Alison has been monitoring the question area. I believe we've got some questions. Please do, and we encourage, just in this final stage, to continue your questioning through the panel in your webinar screen. But if I just hand over to Alison, all the hard questions, Paul, just to preface this, are coming in your direction.
Great.
Right. So first question here is, who would be the best person to sponsor a transformation project?
So I think the role of the sponsor is actually is pivotal and key to the success of any project, not just a transformation project. From a transformational point of view, obviously the first thing would be it's somebody who has the authority really to develop the strategy and also to provide the resources needed for the transformation. Quite often we see people like the CIO or IT directors would be taking up this role as sponsor. But what we would recommend really is to try and, in order to identify who the right sponsor would be, is ultimately to work out who in the organisation has the responsibility for managing risk within the business. From that point, because ultimately what we're looking at is through the management of information is also the management of risk within the business. The transformation itself takes on additional risk, but the ultimate aim is to mitigate any risks either to your spend if you're a client, or to your profit if you're a supplier. And quite often what we find is that if you're able to identify that person who has got the authority, then the two programs typically will go hand in hand.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul. So the next one is, can you please give your best example of how to inspire, excite people to change? I don't know if you've got time to answer all of that, but have you any thoughts?
Well, it's a great question. I think the first thing to say is there's a number of resources or studies that have been undertaken, which ultimately all come across a common theme, and that is all people are different. So the first thing in response to that is that there would be no one way of doing it, because what excites and incentivizes one person tends to have the opposite effect on another. So the first thing is to A, recognize that, B, try and identify the different types of people within the organization, and then C, is to then try and tailor the approach to those. So some people might be excited by new technology, some people might be completely petrified of looking at new. I think really the other bit of advice I would give is to not to make it a thing. From a change point of view, if the people within your organization don't realize that there's a change program going on, then you're probably being successful. But I think so having an approach with clear communications that is tailored to different types of individuals is probably what I would is the short answer.
Okay. Another one is, there seems to be confusion on our current project that BIM is just for design information. As document controllers, we believe it's all the project information. What is your opinion?
So can I just repeat the first bit again? Just
yeah.
So
there seems to be confusion on our current project that BIM is just for design information. As document controllers, we believe it's all the project information.
Right. Okay. the question correctly, essentially, a lot of the initiatives and the industry standards around BIM level 2 are actually only relate to information about the built asset. So if you're looking to manage information or produce and exchange information about the built asset, then that's really what a lot of the standards are there to support. Particularly at ISO level, we're very sort of keen to emphasize that this standard is around the management of asset information or information relating to assets. But there are a number of, there's a lot of grey areas without trying to encroach on other functions such as project management, design management, construction management, asset management, commercial management, and all the other management functions, who tend to have their own processes and ways of working. Now, it is common that a lot of people trying to bundle everything in, so all the information into one. Now, that's not impossible. However, obviously, it takes an increased amount of collaboration and effort to try and do that. So, I would probably agree or disagree with the person posing the question, but it's not impossible to do. But as far as we know, BIM level 2 relates specifically to information about an asset.
Yeah, and I think without divulging the audience member fully, to Emma from Group BC's perspective as well, we really appreciate that that there is a focus on quite often on design and contractual deliverables. Yet clearly you've got to get the job done, and I almost characterise, if I look at information, almost like an iceberg, and the contractual deliverables, those that we tend to put more formal control and emphasis on, are the bit that sits atop the waterline, and then below that is everything else that's taking place around decisions. So as information is received into your organisation, all of the decisions that emanate. Whilst there are environments and platforms like our own that support those decisions, so design review, approval, etc. Clearly, we understand that information takes place offline, and what we've seen is as soon as there is ambiguity around information should be stored, anarchy reigns. So when people start to unpack or divert away from, for instance, the common data environment, and they divert to email just because it's more convenient for them, and they start sending emails into your organisation and bypassing the control function. That's when risk is introduced. And when we look at information in its totality, we look at the contractual deliverables, the stuff above the bit of the iceberg above the waterline, but equally we are really sympathetic and want to talk to organisations about everything else that in reality they're managing as well, and trying to provide a framework to help rationalise and manage that as well. So Paul, we've had some great feedback. One of the best webinars I've joined, simple, clear, concise and on point. Thank you. And I think from my perspective, that's really what we wanted to get out of today. Just by way of final wrap up, so we'll finalise the questions there. It's almost as if we prepared for this, but from Group PC's perspective at an implementation level, the projects quite often, from our perspective, when we're talking about the technology enablement piece, work a lot clearer if there is a defined if there's a defined scope, and that's no different. And it often amuses me when I'm engaged with clients who scratch their heads around, for instance, systems implementation projects, yet they're running multi-billion-pound programs and really complex infrastructure projects themselves. And sometimes we forget the solid principles of good project management and how to run. And just to underpin, I found, and I showed this in a webinar late last year, an interesting article in The Economist. When education fails to keep pace with technology, the result is inequality. And without the skills to stay useful as innovations arrive, workers suffer. Enough of them fall behind, society starts to fall apart. And for me, it's kind of education. It just double underlines that point that Paul raised about the importance of this being a people project. We witness and see a real polarization in the industry of pockets of BIM brilliance, but people also that have used BIM as an opportunity to create a fiefdom and to build knowledge and potentially build their own knowledge silo as well, that they're reluctant to let their colleagues in, and we've created this whole new language of TLAs, CDE, BIM, AIM, PIM, EIR, and one of the reasons that Paul's talk resonated with me when I first heard him last year is the simplicity of approach as well, and I think that's absolutely what's needed, just generally around industry to drive this education forward. And you might expect that we have an implementation that maps on, and right at the outset we are looking for a clear project sponsor, and we're looking for the executive to come with clear project aims. Now, from our perspective, and I had this discussion with Paul a little bit earlier in the week, I was saying that we must do it, we need it, we want to have it. In terms of digital transformation, quite often the hand of industry has been forced, and people come to us to say we've got to deliver on this project and be seen to be compliant with level 2 standards, for instance. So people come at us driving with requirements. Perhaps there's a government client that is saying we want BIM, and they're expecting their supply chain to deliver. So in that sense, sometimes we have to deliver to the aims of the client, yet perhaps the brief isn't as clearly defined. Not a perfect state, but it's this analogy of just we have to get the job done for our clients, and that's the reality. If I look at our exemplar clients and look at those, I'll pick on one for instance, Sainsbury's. They're very progressive, and for well over a decade they've been thinking about the information that they need to successfully and optimally run their estate, and so they talk about management of digital estate, and making sure that they educate right down into their supply chain what they expect in terms of information deliverables coming into them, and setting up their environments and their tools and their briefing documents as they're onboarding new suppliers into their supply chain of how they need to operate. And interestingly, they're the most BIM client, without ever using the word BIM, that I've come across in the kind of 23 years that I've been working in industry. And I think just to double underline, I've picked on one consultant that we've got. So we recognise that these projects are people projects, and it's important to us that we've got people. So in this instance, Simon, originally a quantity surveyor from Davis Langdon, that's having a short sabbatical on the IT supply side for the last 18 years, and working with ourselves, bringing an enormous amount of expertise and experience, but also a lot of empathy to actually the pressures of trying to balance an implementation and change project alongside the day job as well. Just finally, we do welcome your feedback on today's webinar. So over and above the excellent comments that you've put in the Q&A area, if there's anything else, please do get in contact. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, we will share Paul's details, but he's easy to find. Paul Shillcock and Operam, but equally, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Group BC, we'd be delighted to come and speak to you on site, or if you prefer the sound rather than the look of us, then I'm happy to do that online as well.